With 2 games under its belt, it was starting to look like the Super Famicom's reign with Fire Emblem was coming to an end. With the release of the Nintendo 64 in 1997, Nintendo was starting to shift its focus to developing games for its next console, as a company normally does when it develops a new product. With that in mind, it was only natural that Fire Emblem, a rather popular series in Japan at this point, would also slowly make the migration over to the Nintendo 64. Or at least that was the initial plan. Shigeru Miyamoto mentioned in an interview in 1997 about an upcoming Fire Emblem title that would be developed for the Nintendo 64's disk drive. But for reasons that have never been made entirely clear, the game was cancelled. The development of the game was moved to the Game Boy Advance, what would later become Fire Emblem: The Binding Blade. Something interesting about all this though is that development had begun on another Fire Emblem side project for the Super Famicom. The game was originally supposed to be a smaller project and have a much shorter development time, but apparently as the project evolved, the staff decided to go ahead and create a full Fire Emblem game out of it. But this isn't Did You Know Gaming, it's a much worse show called Tall Fox. But with that, this is Fire Emblem Thracia 776. Thracia 7076 is the 5th Fire Emblem game in the series and the 3rd on the Super Famicom. It's also the 2nd Fire Emblem game set in the land of Jugdral, the other being Genealogy of the Holy War. So with that on the table, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers the best I can, but because of this game's setting, there's probably going to be some Genealogy spoilers. Sorry. Thracia 7076's story takes place during the events of Genealogy of the Holy War. More specifically, it takes place in between 2 chapters of that game, chapters 6 and 7, which is set during Genealogy's 2nd generation of heroes. The hero of this story is Leif, the prince of the kingdom of Manster, and the only Fire Emblem main character in the series to have a normal hair color. Ever since certain events in the first game, Leif has been on the run for most of his life along with his guardian, Finn. Eventually, however, the two manage to find a nice little village to settle down with, along with a nice group of beefed up pirate bandits that become their pals, along with one hot sword lady. Leif and Finn's peace can't last, however, as an evil lord named Raedric figures out who Leif is and kidnaps his friends to force him out of hiding. One thing leads to another, and Leif decides that he needs to stop running, instead must live up to his royal heritage and do what must be done, taking back his home country and fighting against the country of Thracia. The gameplay of Thracia took Fire Emblem back to its basics, or at least what was considered basic back then. Since the game was being developed as a side project initially, the team decided to dial back Genealogy's huge maps, and instead worked more off of the gameplay structure that Mystery of the Emblem had. To this end, the game's maps were smaller, and the game's chapters were the standard length of most Fire Emblem games. Instead of only being a handful of characters for you to nurture and grow attached to like in Genealogy, Thracia gives you more and more characters as the game goes on, just like any other Fire Emblem game. There's also a lot of things added in that were missing in Genealogy, like finally being able to trade items, or the inclusion of personal healing items. But while there were little things like this that made aspects of the game less frustrating, that in no way meant that Thracia was going to be a walk in the park. And in fact, most fans considered Thracia to be the hardest game in the Fire Emblem series. Let's go ahead and take a pause here to have a little talk about video game difficulty. For the most part, it's subjective. If you don't want to test that theory, just go onto a video game forum and say X is a hard game, and then wait to see how many people respond talking about how easy the game actually is and what you're doing wrong. Psh, Dark Souls isn't hard. I can beat it blindfolded using only Rock Band drums. Are you freaking serious right now? Thracia is no different. I see opinions on this game all the time about how someone will say it's hard, only for another person to butt in and say that's not hard at all, it's just challenging, and that you're not doing it right. The point to take from all this is that your mileage may vary on these things. For me personally, I sometimes found Thracia to be challenging in a fun way, and sometimes in a not so fun way, but to really understand where I'm coming from on this, we first need to talk about just what makes this game uniquely difficult when compared to other games in the series. The development team behind Thracia put a lot of effort into trying to find ways to make the game more challenging to players, and to that end, there's several gameplay features added to Thracia that were specifically made to make it a harder Fire Emblem title. A lot of these mechanics have never been seen in a Fire Emblem game ever again. One of the most notable features in Thracia was the fatigue system. Basically, the way it worked was that if you deployed a unit for 2 chapters in a row, then on the 3rd chapter, they'd have to sit it out because they were too tired. The only character that was immune to the fatigue system is Leif, because apparently he's some sort of a Cylon that's being powered by the sweat of his allies. What this means is that you can't rely on a single good team of units to carry you through the story of Thracia. You have to alternate your units on the regular, or else you get stuck using a bunch of weak units that you've been neglecting. I ended up taking a page out of my middle school basketball career and made an A team that were my go-to heavy hitters and a B team that would fill in when it was time for them to take a breather. The only thing missing here was the C team that was made up of everyone else that was good enough to be on the team, but sucked too much to actually play in the game. I was on the C team. Fire Emblem games are known for having loads and loads of playable characters, all with different strengths and weaknesses. Some are worth using and some aren't. It's the same thing in every single game. It's actually a pretty rookie mistake to try and use everyone in the game equally. Instead, it's often a much better idea in these games to just build up a single team of units to use for the entire game. Otherwise, you'll just end up with an entire army of mediocre units and make life harder on yourself. Thracia subdued that element though. It just wasn't possible to use the same team consistently at all times. Everybody had to pull their weight at some point or another. On the one hand, this did make the game more challenging, and it really made you learn your army a little bit better instead of just using what you were comfortable with. While on the other hand, it could still be pretty frustrating. What if you needed to use your only mage to kill a boss who had stupid amounts of physical defense? What if you needed your one healer to come into work, but she couldn't because she was taking a nap? I guess this makes the game a little bit more realistic, but I don't play these games for realism. There's also another weird gameplay element that made Thracia surprisingly more realistic than it really needed to be. Apparently someone over at Nintendo heard the jokes people were making about genealogy having too much focus on mounted units, because the mounted units in this game got nerfed to hell and back. Thracia reuses a mechanic that was briefly used in New Mystery of the Emblem, the ability of mounted units to go indoors by getting off their horse first. No really, at some point between this game and genealogy, somebody must have told Chozukaga that it was unsanitary and impolite to bring one's steed indoors. Alright guys, listen up. The war's going smoothly. We really don't. Finn!
Sorry,
Finn,
just,
we talked about
try
this.
to squeeze in. Don't mind me. No, that's okay. No, sorry. No, it's okay. Sorry. Just squeezing in. Sorry, just coming in.
When a character gets off their mount, they lose a large bonus of being on a mount in the first place, their mobility. That's annoying in its own right, but the thing that makes no goddamn sense is how mounted units can only use swords while on the ground. If they're a sword user like Fergus, then that's not really an issue, but what about characters like Finn? Finn's a lance knight, yet somehow he forgets how to stick them with a pointy end once he's no longer sitting on his ass. And obviously this isn't an issue on the maps that mostly take place outside, but mounted units lose practically all their utility whenever a stage takes place indoors. It's a mechanic that pretty much encourages the player to use mounted units as little as possible because they're useless for what seems like half the game. The most outrageous example of this in motion is near the start of the game where Leaf is captured and a bunch of mounted units are his only allies, despite the fact that one of the characters shows up with an axe and is fighting against lance soldiers, aka soldiers that he'd be strong against, but the guy can't use it. You don't even get to have these characters properly mount up until 3 chapters later. Another thing introduced here was the capture mechanic. This sort of came back years later in Fates, but it worked a lot differently in this game. When attacking an enemy unit, a character has the option of attempting to capture them. If they tried this, they'd take a huge hit to their attack bonuses, but if they managed to reduce their target's HP to 0, they'd capture and pick them up, at which point they could strip them of all their possessions and then set them loose. Of course, there's still the issue that the game doesn't really tell you how capturing works. There's a conversation in an early chapter about trying to spare an enemy unit instead of killing him. That's pretty vague. I mean, in most games that would just mean you're trying to avoid the guy, not hog tie him. Your own units can be captured too if you're not careful. You can get them back by killing the guy that took them before he ran off, but if they got captured then they immediately lose all the items they're holding, so it's almost as bad as them dying. The reasoning behind that is because capturing enemy units is extremely vital to long-term success in Thracia. Unlike other Fire Emblem games, getting gold supplies in Thracia is actually pretty difficult. The game doesn't just hand you mounts of cash every few chapters like in other games, you really gotta work for it. If you want gold to buy items, you have to steal or capture weapons from units so you can sell them. You can also just hold on to the weapons yourself for your own use. If your thief is good enough, they can actually steal weapons off the enemy, even if they have it equipped. I normally don't use thieves too much in Fire Emblem, save for specific situations, but I sure did in Thracia for just how damn useful they were. Resource management is more important in Thracia than it is in pretty much any other Fire Emblem game. You don't have a lot of money, so you can't repair or buy new weapons easily, and getting weapons from the enemy can be hard since thieves are fragile and capturing units is a huge gamble. If a mass objective was to escape the level instead of capturing a castle, I made sure to get the hell out as early as possible. I just couldn't waste resources farming for XP in this game. I had to make that strategic call. Of course, I also needed to make sure that everyone else escaped before Leaf did, or else this would happen. Wherever to go? Finally, the last annoying thing in Thracia involved healing staves, in that they can miss. For a bit of context, healing staves have always been the one ability in Fire Emblem that didn't rely on RNG. If you were injured and you needed a heal, there was a hot cleric or a wrinkly old man to help you out, based on your personal preference of course. Heals were something that were guaranteed and played a huge part into the strategy of Fire Emblem. Not everything was a shoo-in during a fight, but it was nice knowing that you always had the healer to fall back on in case things went awry. Not really the case in Thracia. If you got injured and need a heal right away, you might get it, or your healer might whiff the heal altogether and you die. Personally, I hated this mechanic. The game had enough going for it in terms of a challenge already. Putting in randomly ineffective healing spells didn't make the game more challenging, just made it aggravating. I don't mind challenging video games every once in a while, but there has to be a balance between what's challenging and what's just plain unfair. It's the whole reason that my feelings with Thracia are so mixed. I do like the game, but there's certain aspects to the gameplay that just make it hard to love all the time. I think my main problem with Thracia's difficulty is the inconsistency of it. Sometimes you'll have a fairly straightforward map that doesn't take much thought to get through. And sometimes you get a challenging yet fair map that offers several options on how to tackle it, and if you mess up, it's your own fault. And there's sometimes where the game just straight up screws with you and your success hinges on luck. Here's an example of a challenging but fair map. In this map, there's 3 main routes you can take to reach the enemy castle, an upper, middle, and lower path. Each route has pros and cons to it, and you can really tailor how you play the game based on those. The middle path is the most straightforward and fastest route, but it'll take you right through the heart of the enemy forces and have a pair of ballista raining down on you the whole time. There's a group of knights blocking the way, but they won't move unless you attack them. The upper path barely has any bad guys, but has a single ballista and a long-range mage guarding it. You might want to take this route if you have units with high resistance, but otherwise you might want to avoid it. And then finally, the lower path has the least amount of ballista, but there's a drawbridge. The only way to get across it is either have a thief work it or steal a key off an early enemy unit. The design of this map is pretty great. It wasn't a walk in a park no matter what route you took, but the player had the options of where they could respond to based on their own playstyle. It was challenging, but fair, one of the best kind of difficulties. But you want to know what the layout of the next map? Leaf gets stuck in a room behind 6 locked doors while 2 ballista appear and rain down hell on him. This is kind of a recurring problem with Thracia. They bait you in with a good map and then throw this BS at you. Maps where friendly characters start on the other side of several walls and you have to pray they can dodge long enough for you to reach them. Maps where you'll be completely screwed if you didn't bring enough thieves to unlock all the doors, or you didn't manage to snatch enough door keys off enemies to get the doors, or you couldn't do what I did and just use the warp staff to send someone up there to kill the ballista. It's because of things like this that my feelings for Thracia are so mixed when it comes to difficulty. I want to enjoy a challenging strategy game sometimes, but I don't want that challenge to be based off of a coin toss. This problem seemed to go away a bit towards the end of the game, but early and mid-game were all over the place for me. You know, with all this talk about Thracia's gameplay, you might even be wondering if the game has a story at all, and it does. It's okay, it's not terrible, but it's not really groundbreaking either. The thing about writing sequels and midquels is you have to be careful about how you handle the material in relation to the main series. When Leaf showed up in Genealogy, the only people he had with him were Finn and Nana. So right away, going to Thracia, we know that despite this being Leaf's story about how he united dozens of people under a common banner and took the fight against a tyrant, none of those people are going to show up later to help him. Or at least you would think that, but then some characters show up and make cameos anyway. Thracia is some sort of weird mix between a midquel and a reimagining. That's pretty much all I can really say about the main plot without giving away some major spoilers about both Genealogy and this game. Thracia is in a bit of an odd place in the timeline. Since the game was originally being developed as a side project, Shozu Kaga, the creator and writer of Fire Emblem, said that he had to be really careful when writing this game, so he didn't mess up any of the structure of Genealogy. He actually admitted that if he had known that the game would get as big as it did, he would have just written a completely different story instead of going off one he had already done. This also means that while characters from Genealogy can and will show up, they are pretty much just regulated to cameos. They exist for the player to go, ooh, it's Sid, I remember Sid, he was my best character in the last game. Oh, he's so powerful and cool, and he's gone. Also, as a minor note, I think it's pretty funny how Kaga was worried about stepping on Genealogy's toes, but had no issue with giving characters canon love interest in regards to the previous game. In this game, Nana is just Finn's daughter, which had the potential to happen in Genealogy, but didn't have to happen if you didn't want it to. It's especially jarring to me, considering I had let Finn be single. No, Nana's father was a timid, redheaded mage that mated with a princess who had a crush on her brother. Get it right, game. A weak or uninteresting story can often be forgiven with likable and engaging characters, but unfortunately Thracia fell into the issue that early Fire Emblem games had by lacking the support mechanic, which wasn't really a fault to its own, but more of the time when the game was made. Genealogy didn't have supports either, but it did have the lovers mechanic, which helped to flesh out just a few characters. It also had the benefit of having a much smaller main cast for both generations, so it was easier to get attached to your units. With Thracia, there's only a handful of characters that have a lasting impact on the plot. Anyone else might say a few words about themselves when they join up with Leaf, but never really talk to them again for the rest of the game. It's hard to get invested in characters when the only attribute that makes you care about them is how effective they are in battle. And just as one final note when it comes to Thracia's story, I kinda wish the game just hadn't been about Leaf. A lot of times characters will get prequels about them because they're an interesting and favorite lesser character that we want to know more about, but the thing is I never really had that feeling towards Leaf. In Genealogy, Leaf was a character that had connections to some first generation characters in the same way that most other characters did. He was a little more important than your average unit, but there was never really much of a sense of him having wasted character potential, at least no more than any of the other children characters. Leaf even has his own personal character arc in Genealogy, something that several other characters never even got. By the end of Genealogy, I really felt like I knew everything I wanted to know about Leaf. If he had shown up as a bitter and cold foil to Seliph, I might be a little interested in wanting to see what turned him into that, but he didn't. Truth be told, Leaf's a pretty vanilla character in both games. So did I like Thracia? Yeah, I'd say I did. I mean, it's not high on my list of favorite Fire Emblem games, but I'd say it did okay. I will say one thing about Thracia 7076 though. Despite the game's missteps in implementing its difficulty, and despite the story being kinda weak, I really admire how well the game's narrative and themes coexist with its gameplay. Unlike most Fire Emblem games, Leaf Army is not a royal conscript. He has knights fighting for him, true, but he's also got a ton of bandits and common men and women fighting for him too. You're constantly running away in the early levels before you can get much support. You have to steal from enemies with thieves and hold them down while you rip all their gear off them. Thracia's gameplay really represents what a difficult situation that Leaf and his companions are in. They're trying to fight back against an almighty empire with the bare minimum stuff that they have. It's not supposed to be easy. If what you're looking for in a game is a challenge, then I definitely recommend Thracia, but there's just certain aspects of the game that kind of hold it back for me. But that's just my opinion, you might think differently. Anyway, that's it for all the Super Famicom games. Next time we'll look at a game that I've personally been looking forward to for quite some time. It's the game that's got our boy Roy in it.